When I lived at the Drumm Farm Institute, that rustic utopia among a posse of some 40 boys, house parents and supervisors, beef and dairy cattle, hogs, sheep, chickens, vagrant feral cats, and love-bombed dogs, Andrew Drumm himself was something of a mystery. He loomed over us like the projected image of the Wizard of Oz in the classic motion picture of that name, our guardian and protector, stern but also generously paternal. His gift of food and shelter and the opportunity of education demanded of us no obeisance. We were not even required to learn his backstory. We were a scrappy lot to begin with, not the shivering newsboy doorway sleepers of yore, but indigent and half-orphaned, feed-sack-shirted, chop-haired, nail-bitten, and ill-shod, the sweep of backcountry cabins and mean city streets, skinny and sometimes hungry, whatever the cat dragged in. At Drumm, we were plainly, decently, but not distinctively clad, as the founder's will has it. We were fed from the bounty of the eastern Jackson County loam. Oh, daily roast beef and mashed potatoes. Oh, creamed peas and fried chicken for Sunday dinner. We were expected to stand on our own 2 feet, to earn our bread like Adam by the sweat of our brow, to embrace the customs and duties of farming, to plant and weed and harvest, to milk and shovel and butcher, and in our main hours to study and learn and achieve. Wholly admirable goals, all of them. In the end, they did us proud. We had no idea Andrew Drumm was replicating his boyhood in the institute that he and his Cordelia founded, though it must have been comparable. He did us proud too. Andrew Drumm Institute is a different place now, as it must be in a different time. If there are spirits, his spirit watches over this place. Ralph Emerson famously saw the connection in his essay, Self-Reliance. An institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. What follows is the story of that one man, the man who created this institution, now rounding out its 100th year. Aye zounds, the old major would probably say.
I didn't really pay attention to who Andrew Drumm was. There was the portrait. It seemed very old. I had no real grasp of history at that time. And then a portrait also of Mrs. Drumm. I could sit then and look at that portrait and think a little bit more about who Drumm was. I still didn't know very much, and we really weren't given much information at that point.
There has not been one time where I haven't driven here and had that feeling of, this is a good place, this is a safe place for everybody that comes on campus, physically and emotionally. You matter here, and everyone who's here contributes to helping you matter in some way. That, I think, is a distinct thing that I probably have not felt in the same way anywhere else.
To even think that someone over 100 years ago was interested in helping kids, keep them off the streets, it's mind-boggling.
Well, if Andrew Drumm did roll in here right now, or ride in on his horse, which is how he used to get here from Kansas City, I think he would come up, he'd ride around, he'd take a look, and he would be really proud of what his legacy and his values resulted in.
Andrew Drumm was born in 1828 in rural Ohio and grew up on what became ultimately a 640-acre farm operated by his mother and father. And it's clear to understand that he knew intimately all of the tasks involved with growing up on a farm in the early 19th century. And it's easy to imagine that Andrew Drumm could have decided to stay in Ohio and work the land that his father had set aside for him, but he chose not to do that. When word of the discovery of gold in California began to circulate in 1848, he was the young man among many young men in Ohio and across the country who decided to act on that news. The young Mr. Drumm had to take a stagecoach from Ohio to Baltimore and then find a steamboat up to New York, where he then turned around and booked passage on a steamer down to Panama. Once in Panama, and of course this is 1850, he apparently had to basically walk and then ride a boat on a river before he crossed over to the western coast. They were still only around halfway there after all of that, and he had to wait to get on board a steamship, which was apparently very crowded, to take them into San Francisco Bay. Ultimately, we can safely say this ordeal took several months, and remember, that's several months just to get him to where the action really was, in Central California near Sacramento, where everybody was digging up gold. It's interesting to think, too, that he had promised his mother to return from California after about a year. And for obvious reasons. It was a very hazardous journey, a very dangerous thing, a very dangerous adventure to consider. And he did that. He honored that pledge. He returned from California to Ohio after about 12 or 13 months. That is where we get this great anecdote from one of Andrew Drumm's brothers, John Frank. When Andrew returned home to Ohio from California, he was kind of intent on demonstrating how well he had done during the gold rush. But according to the story, he gambled away much of what he earned out in California, to the point that when he arrived at his brother John's home, he literally had a pair of pants that were falling off him. And so one of his nieces, Mary, had to repair those pants to give him at least a dignified way to go see his mother and father. It's unclear just how long Andrew Drumm remained in Ohio after returning from California to honor his mother's wishes. He apparently did attend one academic year at what is now Ohio Wesleyan. So it's not like he grew immediately restless and went back west. No, he apparently, gave it his best shot, attended school, attended this business college, but then ultimately decided, I'm going to head back. This time, on the second time, he went the overland route, hooked up with a wagon train out of St. Joseph, Missouri, and eventually wound up back in Central California. It's fair to say that perhaps he discovered his real vocation while not digging for gold. A lot of entrepreneurs, while also, going out and digging for gold in California, began to realize that they could also make some decent money by providing basic services to all of the gold miners. In Andrew Drumm's case, he began to drive livestock. He began to herd hogs. He started herding cattle, driving cattle north from Texas to California. And he was able to market this fresh meat, and apparently was often paid in either gold nuggets or gold dust. Andrew Drumm was out in California around 18 or 19 years. Once he returns in the early 1850s, and he stays until 1870. But then he leaves, decides to set himself up in what is now northern Oklahoma and what became the Ute Ranch. He begins to start driving cattle from Texas north to southern Kansas. And remember, in southern Kansas, what was going on right after the Civil War was that the railroads were building as rapidly as they could west from Kansas City in communities like Abilene. And then these railroad operators, very eager to establish a freighting business with that cattle and bringing it to Kansas City, where Andrew Drumm has already built his first meatpacking facility in 1870. Andrew Drumm eventually operated his ewe ranch in what became known as the Cherokee Strip, or outlet, in what is now northern Oklahoma. It's basically a very long rectangle. Beginning after the Civil War and into the 1870s, you had cattle drivers like Andrew Drumm driving their herds north from Texas right through that Cherokee outlet. Some representatives of the Cherokee Nation decide to collect their own rent or lease particular parcels of land, but in a kind of like very unorganized way. There was a lot of confusion as to where some parcels ended and began. Andrew Drumm apparently was one of the first entrepreneurs to install barbed wire in his section of Oklahoma, but there were still disputes. And so ultimately you have Drumm with a number of cattlemen, a number of other cattle entrepreneurs, establishing what came to be called the Cherokee Strip Livestock Association, simply to arbitrate disputes like this, but also to negotiate officially with members of the Cherokee Nation. And that arrangement held up for several years. But eventually, the federal government decided that that land should be settled. And it was in the early 1890s that they ordered all cattle entrepreneurs like Andrew Drumm to clear their livestock off that land. And that's what Drumm and his colleagues did. And then the Livestock Association actually was officially disbanded in Kansas City in 1893. Andrew Drumm formally joins the Kansas City Livestock Association in 1889. And he's immediately one of the more formidable individuals who belong to that organization. And he cast a long shadow, is a financier, loans money to other cattlemen as what became known as a livestock commission man or cattleman. And he's not necessarily raising cattle anymore. He's not driving cattle from Oklahoma to southern Kansas, but he is marketing cattle. And he's also loaning money to other cattle entrepreneurs. He knows that business obviously back and forth. He's been buying and selling livestock, remember, from the early 1850s in California. And so by the time that you get to the 1880s and the 1890s, when the livestock and the meatpacking and the stockyards represents the principal growth industry in Kansas City, Andrew Drumm is one of the most prominent members of that industry. He marries Cordelia Green of Liberty in 1886. Mr. Drumm was 58 years old. Cordelia was 40 years old. She was born in 1845, grew up in Liberty, northeast of Kansas City, attended a school known as the Clay Seminary, which was considered a school with a rigorous curriculum, not a finishing academy. Its graduates were skilled speakers and debaters. And at the commencement exercises of the Clay Seminary, the residents of Liberty routinely packed the public halls to hear the young women speak. Cordelia graduated in 1862. By the latter 1860s and mid-1870s, she's an independent young woman. She's a music instructor, teaching students both in Liberty and in Plattsburgh. And then she decides in 1886 to marry Andrew Drumm. And then she becomes truly an equal partner in his growing interest in what became the Drumm Farm. One of the most interesting topics about Mr. Drumm, I think, is the newsboy story. The story goes that sometime before World War I, Andrew Drumm attended an event, a benefit of some kind, for Kansas City's newsboys. And at some point was led outside to look at the alley in which these young newsboys slept. And apparently, according to how the story goes, he went home to his wife, Cordelia, and said, "I will do what I can to remedy this." And so he decides to buy this property and establish this farm. And then with Cordelia, at some point before World War I, we're not quite sure when, they traveled to visit similar institutions in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Chicago to see how they operate. And remember, Mr. Drumm is not a social worker. He's a cattleman, but he's also a good businessman, and he decides that he wants to see for himself how these things operate. And it's fair to say that he did his homework, because here we are 100 years after his death, and his vision can still be seen here in Independence. Meade McClure is one of my favorite characters in the Andrew Drumm story because he's hired basically as a bank clerk in one of Andrew Drumm's banks in southern Kansas. But over time, he becomes an expert in the cattle industry, banking, and then in 1899 moves to Kansas City to work for Mr. Drumm in his livestock commission company. In 1919, only a few weeks after Mr. Drumm's death, Meade McClure obviously has this sense of urgency to make sure that Andrew Drumm's story gets told. In May of 1919, he delivers what basically is a formal paper to the members of a historical society in Kansas City, establishing Mr. Drumm's role in the formation of the cattle economy of the Southwest in the late 19th century. Even though Meade McClure was a member of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City, and you would think would have a clearly crowded calendar, he felt this was his first order of business after Mr. Drumm's death, to make sure that everybody knew how important Mr. Drumm's role was, not only in the cattle economy, but the economy of Kansas City. He also organizes in 1932 the installation of this monument or obelisk, marking the spot of the former U Ranch site in northern Oklahoma. That was a time, a very specific and dynamic and certainly romantic era, perhaps in the minds of many Americans. Mr. Drumm was pivotal in the establishment of that.
My mom and dad had told me about Mr. Drumm running cattle before the opening of the turkey strip, and that it was, you know, in honor of him from his wife after he had passed. And as a child, I mean, it was just part of the history of that area. The area had also, when my mother was a child, she grew up 2 miles from the monument. They used to find a lot of Indian artifacts, and they even Indian skeleton that Northwestern did have for a while was found there on the property by school kids walking to school. So it's just always part of the history of, you know, Northwest Oklahoma. But the monument to the U Ranch was always a fixture in the pasture. I grew up with it being, you know, something special on the hill and the pasture. The opening here in Alfalfa County of the turkey strip was the last land run in Oklahoma. They had opened other portions to settlement by the pioneers. Prior to that, I don't remember how many land runs they had, something like 5. Family story goes that my great-grandfather purchased a fast horse just for that race. The monument is located on the southeast corner of 262 acres that are used primarily to graze livestock. My husband and I have curly horses, and they have their little area, and the rest is cattle of my grandsons and mine, and then we have 2 renters that utilize the rest of it all for cattle. So it's kind of been true ever since before the strip opened, when Major Drumm was there. It was cattle, still cattle.
When my brother was 13 and I was just about 12 on a very hot summer day, he had been sent to the grocery store to get a carton of milk, and by the time it had bounced its way home in the basket of his bicycle, there was a hole in the bottom and it was leaking, and my stepmother felt that that was an indication that he was trying to poison her and began to beat him with a fungo bat, a little baseball bat. And at that point, he was old enough to think, I'm not going to do this anymore. And he pulled the bat out of her hands, made a really crucial decision not to beat her with it, which he might well have done, and that would have sent him off in a totally different trajectory. So he went to the police, a very brave thing to do. And fortunately, even though in 1949, which this was, there was very little in the way of social welfare in America, basically. The concept of child abuse had really just begun to penetrate the social welfare world. But the police recognized that he was dirty and bruised and, most of all, starving, underweight, as we both were, and thought, we've got to give this kid some kind of help. So in the course of time, a social worker investigated the case. We were brought before a really enlightened juvenile court judge, and he gave Stanley the choice of going to what was essentially the juvenile delinquents home, or a place called the Drumm Institute, which was a home for boys, indigent boys, out in Independence, Missouri. We understood, we'd been there once when my stepmother had been trying to find a place to put us as we got too big for her to control. So we knew vaguely what it was, and Stanley wisely chose Drumm. And off we went. And I think the most vivid thing I remember about that is that when we arrived, at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they pulled the food out of the refrigerators in the kitchen, and I think we ate for the next 2 hours.
At the age of 5, I remember seeing my mother at a bus stop get on a bus and wave goodbye, and I'm going, well, where is she going, to the store? And that's the last I saw of her. And at that point, we were still with a parent, a father, and like any kids, we were not on a tight leash when your parents are at work, and they went to work real early before school started, so therefore we weren't attending real regular school. So at that point, the Child Service Division got involved, and I became a ward of the Jackson County Court at the age of 5.
We were the poorest family in Blue Springs, bar none. My dad, he was quite old when I was born. And I can remember he worked in a trash truck for a while, and he worked on a putt-putt car on the railroad for a while. But after that, he didn't have a job. And his education was 4th grade, and my mother's education was 6th grade. And my mother was a cook and a waitress in the Coffee Cup Cafe in Blue Springs, Missouri when I came out here. And the guy who was running it was kind enough to let her stay there since we didn't have a home. So she stayed there. And there was a guy in Blue Springs named Hal Leggett that owned most of the land that Lake Jacomo was on. He also owned a hardware store. He took care of the Blue Springs Cemetery. And I would work with him all the time. He'd come by and pick me up. He said, come on. I said, you can be my helper today. And we would dig graves, and he'd throw me down the grave, and I'd square it up and get the stuff out of the bottom, and then they'd pull me up out of there in a bucket. But anyway, that's how I come out here. He brought me out here, introduced me to Harry Nelson, and said he needs a home. He has none. We had nothing. I had 2 pair of jeans and 2 shirts to my name, and I brought them out here, and they threw them away. And they give us new clothes, and we ate 3 times a day. I'd never done that for my whole life. And It was good food, yeah.
The cook pulled lots of dishes of food, big bowls of potatoes and roast beef and Lord knows what else, green beans. It was midsummer, out of the refrigerator, and put all this before us, and I'd never seen such a bounty. And we just ate and ate and ate. And I talked to the cook about it later, and she said, I wasn't sure we'd have enough leftovers for you two. It was the beginning of a sense that I developed over the years at Drumm of the real bounty of the natural world. But to arrive at this place, which was full of farm animals and a huge vegetable garden, and one could see corn growing in the fields, and just every kind of indication that we wouldn't be hungry anymore. I don't think I really grasped that yet. I was kind of terrified. It was an entirely new universe to have to adjust to, and I was just happy my brother was there with me, because he had been my guardian angel all through childhood anyway. And now here we were together in this entirely new world.
Some of the people that I lived with here have been my friends my entire life, and we're still close.
I would say growing up out here was probably the best thing that ever happened to me.
I was not only lucky in going to Drumm when I did, I was 30 pounds underweight at the age of 12. At least I gained 30 pounds in the next 3 months.
Mr. Burkmeyer, I can still remember him. He said, first 3 months you were here, you gained more than the pigs. I can't remember what I weighed when I first came here, but it wasn't much. But I gained like 30 pounds. And since we were working, it was muscle instead of fat, which was good.
You haven't lived until you've hoed a row of field corn, and then another one and another one and another one all day, and it's 110 degrees, and there are giant spiders, giant webs down the row, and you're working away, and you come across the spider shaking its web as if to say, "Watch out! Don't tear down this web, I just spent the whole week building it." And so you duck around and go past it, and then you hoe some more. It was, in so many deep, deep ways, an education that was invaluable.
Athletic competition meant a lot to Drumm Farm, because at one point the Drumm Farm had 20 boys to choose from to come up with a varsity football team. And at that point they played East High School. And East High School was the Interscholastic League champions. They had won the championship, and Drumm Farm wanted to play them, their varsity team. And so they granted that, and Drumm Farm actually beat East High School's varsity team with our group of ragtag, throw it together football team.
And they said, "We don't want to play them no more." But this coach came out here, and he seen us with a bale of hay climb over a gate. Instead of opening it, of course, you climb over it with a bale of hay on our shoulder. He said, "Oh man, I'd like to have them guys for my line,
The achievement really healed me and the other boys from the learned helplessness that had been one of the real curses of our previous experience.
We had a grape vineyard out in our garden, and grape vineyard means we had one row of grapes. And we thought, we got creative one day, and we thought, well, we could make some wine out of these grapes. We took the grapes and picked a bunch of grapes and put them in a container, I think in our t-shirts, as we rolled our t-shirt up and stuffed as many as we could get in our t-shirts. Then we found us a gallon jar. We thought, we rinsed it out real good, And then what we did is we took our athletic socks, white socks, and we put all the grapes in there and squeezed the grapes and made our own wine, or grape juice as it was back then. And we thought, well, now if we had a place where this could ferment, where could we hide this so nobody knows that we're going to ferment this grape juice and make wine out of it? Because that's all we thought it was, just ferment your grape juice and you had wine. It seemed simple enough. So we thought for a while, and we thought, well, let's go down to the lower barn. And we crawled up in the loft where we kept all of our hay stacked. And we thought, well, let's crawl back in here and let's make a tunnel, and maybe we'll hide it in the tunnel. We put our gallon jar in there, and we thought after about 3 weeks, with the temperature probably hitting about 100 degrees or higher during the summer, we thought, well, that should be plenty of time for it to ferment. And sure enough, we filed down, but we didn't want to go in a big group because we didn't want anybody to get suspicious that we were going to our secret room. And unbeknown to us, Mr. Berkmeyer was on campus at the time and was kind of watching one of the boys go in, and he thought nothing of it. Then another one, we weren't real smart about it. We were pretty close to each other going in the barn, and it ended up to be about 12 boys. Pretty soon he raised his voice real high, and we knew he was angry. And he goes, you boys need to come out wherever you're at, and I want to see all your faces, and I want to see them within the next 2 minutes. So get out from where you're at and get down here. So we filed out. Then he says, okay, boys, what are we doing? What are you all doing in the barn? So we told him the truth. We were there, and we'd gotten into the hay, and we'd built a tunnel and a little room, and we put some grape juice, is what we called it, not wine. We put our grape juice up there, and we were going to drink grape juice. He goes, well, how long was your grape juice up there in the barn? We told him, well, we'd put it up there about 3 or 4 weeks ago. He said, I'll tell you what, let's start by taking these bales of hay out of this loft. And there were about 2,000 bales, and that's not an exaggeration. Did you ever think about those bales of hay caving in and burying you guys in that barn, and nobody would know where you were? You could suffocate in that barn. So I want all that torn out. So we got to our little room, we took out all of our bales of hay, and he goes, well, there's probably another 1,000 bales further back here. I want to make sure there's nothing back there either. So let's just take all the hay out of the barn. Then we took it all out, and he goes, well, that looks really good. Now let's see how fast you can stack it back in that barn and make sure that there's no rooms or tunnels in there. And I'm telling you, it was hot. Even though it was nighttime, it was still 80 degrees, and we were all sweating. And it took us a good probably 6 hours to restack all that hay. And he stayed right there with us. And that was the end of our secret rooms. We never wanted to build another one after that. That kind of cured us. And it cured us of winemaking too.
I was in middle school and high school in Independence. I went to school with people who lived at Drumm, and they were all boys at that time. It was always a whisper conversation. They're from Drumm, you know. And so my understanding of what Drumm was and its intent is very different than I've discovered. And if I were having a conversation with Andrew Drumm, probably my first words would be, I had no idea.
To know and find out that someplace like Drumm existed, I too didn't know. Okay, it's like, what? To know that we are giving something back and helping them stay together in in stressful times, it's very comforting to them. It makes them feel safe to be around their sisters and brothers. And being at Drumm is like, this really is just a dream. It really is a dream come true.
It feels like you're at home. You know, you can feel as if, you know, if you didn't have something before, there's something here that can fill that void or that space, even if it's just a friend. You know, some of our young people that I come across have never had a friend before, but they feel like they can trust in. And staff is doing a great job of that here and making you feel like we're always going to be your friend. We're always going to care about you. We'll always have, you know, a place in our heart for you. Even when you discharge and you're on your own, or you know, once you're at Drumm, you're always a part of Drumm. And I think that's beautiful because there's not a lot of places that, you know, you can go that young people and everyone alike really can feel that way.
And even in the midst of some of these young people who've been through some pretty significantly harmful things in their life, just to see them have such a huge capacity to care for other kids on campus, the ways in which they continue to reach out to people in their lives to provide support to other folks, that they have such a huge compassion and desire to help others and to be a support to other people. They are continuously making the world a better place by their gifts and their talents. And we do a huge disservice not only to them, but to the community around us when we aren't supporting them and making that more widely known.
I have to believe that having more than 70 kids here, having children who are getting what they need to be successful in their lives, was at the core exactly what he stated in his will and what I believe he wanted in his heart. And so from soup kitchens and housing during bad weather, Drumm kind of led himself to this location. He found Drumm Farm in 1912. He purchased it and he set out his will that basically said, we're going to start a place that can care for kids who are in need, who are without families. And so we opened in 1919, 100 years ago. And through the years, approaching 2,000 children have been impacted by the vision of Andrew Drumm.
And it's just our desire and our goal for everyone, well, however they come, that they leave here with just that sense of accomplishment and that their situation is stable, healthy, and satisfying for them and sustainable.
I hope Andrew Drumm knows that we understand and appreciate how much he gave us, how much he advised us, how much he impacted us. And I hope that he and anyone else associated with this grand place, I hope they see this as a place of healing and a place of hope. And if Andrew and Cordelia Drumm think that, then we've accomplished a lot.